The bed of the Rhine below Mainz has been swallowing things for 2,000 years, and in the late 1800s, when dredging crews began deepening the channel for modern shipping, the river started giving some of them back. Swords, cavalry fittings, legionary daggers, and helmets, dozens of them, bronze and iron, their crests long gone, their cheekpieces bent by the current. One of those helmets, a bronze design of the type archaeologists now call the Coolus, carried something far more valuable than the metal itself. Scratched into the neck guard, in 4 different hands, punched letter by letter with the tip of a knife or an awl, were 4 names. 4 different men, 4 different centuries of service. By some estimates, the span between the first name and the last could cover close to 50 years of continuous military use, which means this single piece of equipment may have outlived every man who ever wore it. And next to those names sits a small, easily missed symbol, a sideways V. A simple angled stroke that appears not just on this helmet, but on shield fittings, on armor plates, on tools, on roof tiles, on tombstones, across the entire footprint of the Roman Empire, from the moors of northern Britain to the deserts of Egypt. That one mark is the reason a Roman legion of roughly 5,000 men could track every sword, every helmet, and every pair of boots without a single computer, without a printing press, and in an army where many soldiers could barely read. It is one of the smallest artifacts of Roman power, and it may be one of the most important. So what does the sideways V actually mean? Who put it there? And why does it suddenly vanish from Roman equipment in the 3rd century, at almost exactly the moment the classical legion itself begins to disappear? That last question has an answer, and the answer is bleaker than you might expect. We will get there, but first we need to learn how to read a helmet. Here is exactly what this video will walk through. First, what that sideways V symbol means and why it shows up on nearly every category of Roman military object ever recovered, from armor to pottery to gravestones. Second, a surviving pay record from Roman Egypt dated to 81 AD that shows in line-by-line detail how an ordinary soldier effectively purchased his own equipment out of his wages, and why that changes how you should think about every artifact in every museum case. Third, the reason one helmet can carry 4 different names, and what that tells us about a second-hand equipment economy inside the legions that almost nobody talks about. Fourth, the specific soldier in every century whose entire job revolved around these markings, a man whose title survives on tombstones across the empire. And fifth, the moment the marks stop appearing altogether, and why that silence in the archaeological record marks a turning point in the story of Rome itself. Everything here rests on 3 bodies of evidence. The equipment itself, catalogued most thoroughly in Bishop and Colston's standard reference work, Roman military equipment from the Punic Wars to the fall of Rome, which remains the book every specialist reaches for first, and which devotes careful attention to exactly these ownership inscriptions. The paperwork, meaning papyri recovered from the dry sands and rubbish heaps of Egypt, many of them gathered and translated in Robert Fink's collection, Roman Military Records on Papyrus, along with the wooden writing tablets excavated at Vindolanda on Hadrian's Wall from the 1970s onward. And the tombstones, thousands of them, which preserve ranks and job titles no literary source ever bothered to record, because no Roman historian thought a supply clerk was worth a sentence. Where the evidence is thin or contested, I will say so. Go back to that helmet from the Rhine. Picture the moment it was made. The Coolus type takes its modern name from a village in the Marne region of France where an early example was found, and it is a simple, practical design. A rounded bowl like a jockey's cap, a projecting neck guard, hinged cheek pieces, cheap to produce in quantity, which is exactly why the army bought thousands of them in the 1st century. Somewhere in Gaul or Italy, a smith raises a bowl of bronze, rivets on a neck guard and cheek pieces, and sells it into the military supply chain. At this point, it is anonymous. It belongs to no one. Then it reaches a legionary base, and a soldier receives it. And the first thing that happens, before it ever sees a battlefield, is that someone takes a sharp point and punches an inscription into the metal. The technique itself is worth pausing on, because these are usually not flowing scratched letters. They are made punctum, as the specialists say, dot by dot, each letter built from a series of small punched impressions hammered in with a pointed tool, which takes time and deliberation. A soldier sat down one evening in his barrack room, in the 8-man squad called a contubernium that he shared his tent, his meals, and his mule with, and spent perhaps an hour permanently writing on the most expensive object he owned. The formula, repeated on helmet after helmet across the empire, runs like this. First comes that sideways V, then a man's name in the possessive form, meaning of this man. Then a second name, written plainly. Translated, the whole line reads something like, Century of Valerius, property of Lucius. The sideways V is a piece of scribal shorthand, an abbreviation the Romans used constantly, and it stands for the word centuria, the century, the basic building block of the legion, a unit of roughly 80 men, 10 of those 8-man squads, commanded by a centurion. A full imperial legion contained 10 cohorts, and, in the standard reconstruction, 59 or 60 of these centuries, each one named not by a number a soldier would have to memorize, but by the man who ran it, because everyone knew who their centurion was. So the inscription is an address. It tells you the unit, identified by its commanding centurion's name, and then the individual owner within that unit. It is, in effect, a 2-line database entry, punched permanently into bronze. Now look again at the Rhine helmet with its 4 names. Each time the helmet changed hands, the new owner added his own line, and, in at least some surviving cases, the century name changes too, meaning the helmet did not simply pass from bunk to bunk within one unit. It moved. It was reissued, or sold, or transferred, sometimes apparently across units, and each transaction left a scar in the metal. Crucially, the new owner did not erase the old names, and that restraint tells you something. These marks functioned as documents, and you do not scrape out the previous entries in a document of title. You add to them. Hold that image for a moment. A single helmet, passing through the hands of 4 soldiers, each of whom served his time and left, or was discharged, or died, while the helmet went back into circulation and found a new head to protect. Most museum visitors walk past these objects and see a piece of armor. What they are actually looking at is a service record, a chain of custody, and a financial document, all at once. And the reason it is a financial document is the part that surprises almost everyone. Because the Roman state, for all its power, did not simply give a soldier his equipment. It billed him for it. The mechanism works like this, and the proof sits in a papyrus now held in Geneva, catalogued as Geneva Latin Papyrus No. 1, and known to specialists as Roman Military Record 68, dated to 81 AD, during the reign of the Emperor Domitian. It is a pay account for Roman soldiers stationed in Egypt, and it happens to preserve the accounts of 2 named men side by side, both recruited from Damascus in Syria, a legionary called Quintus Julius Proculus and his comrade Gaius Valerius Germanus. The document records their pay arriving in 3 installments across the year, the 3 stipendia, each installment worth roughly 250 drachmas in the local Egyptian currency, the equivalent of about 75 denarii. And then, in careful clerical order, it records the deductions, installment by installment. 10 drachmas withheld, under the heading Fenaria, hay and bedding, presumably for the squad's mule and the men's mattresses. 80 drachmas withheld in victim, for food, meaning a soldier paid for his own rations out of his own wages. 12 drachmas for caligae and fasciae, boots and the leather bindings that went with them, a recurring charge because a marching army destroys footwear. Money withheld for clothing, and here the 2 accounts diverge in a telling way, because Germanus is charged heavily for clothes in one installment while Proculus is not, meaning these were real individual purchases, not a flat tax. There is even a deduction of around 20 drachmas ad signa to the standards, apparently a contribution to a unit fund, possibly a burial fund, or the camp's Saturnalia celebration, held under the guard of the sacred standards themselves, which doubled as the century's bank vault. And in related military pay records from Egypt, deductions appear for arms as well, in armis, meaning weapons and equipment. By the time the army's own accountants finished subtracting, the soldier kept only a fraction of his nominal wage in hand, with the remainder held on deposit in the unit's strongbox. And the Geneva Papyrus dutifully records each man's carried forward balance, his savings account, down to the drachma. For context, a legionary's base pay in this period stood at 225 denarii a year, raised to 300 when Domitian added a fourth annual installment around 84 AD, the first pay rise the legions had seen in roughly a century, and out of that came nearly everything a soldier wore, ate, and fought with. The soldiers themselves knew exactly how this arithmetic felt. When the Rhine and Danube legions mutinied in 14 AD, in the chaotic weeks after the death of Augustus, the historian Tacitus puts a furious speech in the mouth of a ringleader named Persenius, and the grievances are not about glory or politics. They are about money. 10 asses a day, Persenius says, and out of that, clothing, weapons, and tents all have to be paid for, along with bribes to centurions to escape the worst fatigue duties. That speech, written by a senator with no interest in supply clerks, matches the Geneva Ledger line for line. Understand what this means for the helmet. When a soldier received his equipment, the cost was charged against his pay, which means the helmet was not government property in the way a modern soldier's rifle is. It was his. He had paid for it, or he was paying for it, deduction by deduction. And when his 25 years of service ended, he could keep it, or, far more usefully, sell it back into the system for the next recruit, which is exactly how one helmet accumulates 4 owners. His name punched into the neck guard was not decoration, and it was not sentiment. It was a receipt. It was the ancient equivalent of a title deed, and it protected him in the 2 situations a soldier fears most: theft inside the barracks, where 80 men lived shoulder to shoulder with their entire net worth hanging on pegs, and loss in the chaos after a battle, when equipment litters a field and those same 80 men are trying to sort out whose sword is whose. And this entire system, the deductions, the deposits, the transfers, the resales, had to be administered by someone, which brings us to a job title that survives almost entirely on tombstones: the Custos Armorum, literally the guardian of the weapons. Each century appears to have had one. We know the post was official because it appears in a remarkable document preserved in Justinian's Digest, a list drawn up by the 2nd century jurist and praetorian prefect Teruntinus Paternus, naming every category of soldier classed as immunis, exempt, and the guardian of the arms is on it, alongside the clerks, the medical orderlies, and the craftsmen. He held that status because he carried a specialized responsibility, and his responsibility was the arms store and the records that went with it. Who held what it was worth, what had been issued, what had come back. When a soldier scratched the sideways V in his centurion's name into a new helmet, he was making his equipment legible to that man's ledger. The century was the accounting unit of the entire Roman army. The helmet from the Rhine was not marked for the glory of Rome or the emperor. It was marked so that a clerk with a wax tablet could balance his books. Each helmet, seen from inside the system, was a line item, and the legion, seen from the inside, was 5,000 line items marching in step. If that sounds like an overstatement, 3 pieces of evidence from 3 corners of the empire suggest it is not. The first comes from a battlefield in Germany. In 9 AD, 3 entire legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, under the command of Publius Quinctilius Varus, were ambushed and annihilated in the Teutoburg Forest by a coalition of Germanic tribes led by Arminius, a chieftain who had served in the Roman army and knew exactly how it moved. It was one of the worst military disasters Rome ever suffered, so traumatic that the 3 legion numbers were never used again. For centuries, the site was lost. Then, in 1987, a British Army officer and amateur metal detectorist named Tony Clunn, stationed in Germany, began finding Roman denarii and lead sling bullets in the fields near a place called Kalkriese, north of Osnabrück, and the professional excavations that followed under Wolfgang Schluter uncovered thousands of Roman military fragments scattered along a hillside where the Germans had built a concealing turf rampart. Bone, coin, and shattered equipment, including a haunting iron cavalry face mask found in 1990. The dating evidence is beautifully clean, because among the many hundreds of coins recovered, Not a single one was struck after 9 AD, and many carry a countermark reading VAR for Varus himself, applied to pay issued under his command. And among those fragments, per the excavation team's published finds, was a piece of gear punched with an ownership inscription naming a soldier called Marcus Aius, along with his cohort and his century, the century of Fabricius. Think about what that mark accomplished. A man died in a forest ambush 2,000 years ago. His legion was erased from the army's rolls. His body was never recovered. And yet, because he once spent an evening punching his name and unit into his own equipment, archaeologists could read his identity out of the ground 20 centuries later. The marking system was built to survive chaos, and it survived the worst chaos Rome ever experienced. The second piece of evidence comes from a fort in northern Britain. At Vindolanda, just south of the line of Hadrian's Wall, waterlogged, oxygen-free soil preserved hundreds of thin wooden writing tablets, the first of them pulled from the ground by the archaeologist Robin Burley in 1973. Slivers of birch and alder the size of a postcard, written in ink around 100 AD, the everyday paperwork of a garrison. One of the most famous is a strength report for the first cohort of Tungrians under its prefect Julius Veracundus, which records a nominal strength of 752 men, including 6 centurions, and then accounts for them one category at a time. 456 absent, over 300 of them detached to the base at Corbridge. Of the 296 actually present, 15 sick, 6 wounded, 10 suffering from inflammation of the eyes, leaving, in the tablet's own bleak arithmetic, 265 fit for duty, barely a third of the unit on paper. Other tablets record a package sent to a soldier containing socks, 2 pairs of sandals, and underwear, a merchant's letter complaining about grain, hides, and money owed, inventories, receipts, duty rosters, requests for leave. This is the paper half of the system, whose metal half is punched into the helmets. The army counted everything: men, boots, cloaks, nails, and the equipment inscriptions were simply the counting made permanent, the point where the ledger reached out and touched the object itself. And the third piece of evidence is the pay account from Egypt we have already met, Quintus Julius Proculus and his deductions, because it closes the loop. Germany shows the marks surviving catastrophe. Britain shows the bureaucracy that demanded them. Egypt shows the money that flowed underneath them. A battlefield, a fort, and a rubbish heap, thousands of miles apart, all describing the same machine. There is one more pattern worth noticing in the equipment record. Helmets and armor fittings marked for units based on the Rhine have been recovered in Britain. Some of them plausibly carried across the Channel when the legions of the Rhine frontier were redeployed for the Claudian invasion of 43 AD, and equipment appears to have moved with soldiers, or after them, across provinces, which is exactly what you would expect if gear was privately owned, resold, and reissued rather than locked to a single armory. The Roman military economy was, in part, a second-hand market with a punch-marked paper trail, and it stretched from one end of the known world to the other. So pull all of this together, because the markings, read carefully, tell us 5 distinct things about how the Roman army actually ran, and each one corrects something most people assume about the legions. Number 1. The true unit of the Roman army was not the legion, it was the century. Notice what the inscriptions include and what they leave out. Century of Valerius, property of Lucius. The soldier identifies himself by his centurion, a man he saw every day, who controlled his duties, his punishments, and his equipment ledger. A man who earned perhaps 15 times a common soldier's pay and could have him flogged with the vine staff he carried as a badge of office. The legion, that grand 5,000-man institution with its eagle and its number and its battle honors, is the unit historians write about, but the century was the unit a soldier lived in, and below it, the 8-man contubernium was the unit he ate in, and the marking system proves where his identity sat, because when a man labeled the single most important object he owned, the object that kept his skull intact, the address he chose was his century. Rome's military power, seen from the bottom, was not one enormous machine. It was 60 small ones per legion, each with its own commander, its own accounts, and its own guardian of the weapons. Number 2. The Roman soldier was an owner, and ownership changed his behavior. Because his helmet, his armor, and his weapons were charged against his own pay, every legionary had a direct financial stake in maintaining them. A modern conscript who loses issued equipment faces punishment. A Roman legionary who lost his helmet had, in a real sense, lost his own savings, weeks or months of those hard-won drachmas, and would pay again to replace it. Historians have long noted the remarkable condition and constant repair visible on recovered Roman equipment. Patched shield bosses, re-riveted cheek pieces, resoled boots, bronze fittings crudely but effectively mended by hands that were clearly not master craftsmen. And the ownership system is a large part of the reason. The empire did not need to inspect its way to well-maintained equipment. It aligned the incentives and let 5,000 private owners do the inspecting themselves, every night, in their own barracks. Number 3. Equipment outlived men, and the army was built to allow it. 4 names on one helmet is not an oddity. It is the system working as intended. A helmet represented real value, possibly months of pay, and when its owner retired, died, or was discharged, that value did not evaporate. It was recovered, re-entered into the ledgers, and reissued, with a new name punched below the old one. And the old names left in place, because erasing a prior owner's mark would be something close to forging a document. The result is that a Roman helmet in a museum case is often not one artifact, but a stack of them. A half-century of service compressed into a single object. And the scratched names are its stratigraphy. Layers of ownership you can read the way a geologist reads rock. The oldest inscriptions worn shallow by decades of polishing. The newest still crisp. Number 4. The markings turned the army into something no ancient rival possessed. An institution with a memory. Because units and owners were written onto the objects themselves, the army's knowledge did not live only in clerks' tablets that could burn, or commanders' heads that could be cut off. It lived in the equipment, distributed across tens of thousands of objects, robust against disaster. A kind of accidental redundancy that no Persian, Carthaginian, or Germanic army ever replicated. Because none of them combined mass literacy at the clerical level with private ownership at the soldier level. That is why Kalkriese can yield a name. It is also, on a longer horizon, why archaeologists today can reconstruct unit movements, garrison histories, and supply chains from fragments of bronze, and why we know more about the internal organization of the Roman army than about any other institution of the ancient world. The Romans, without intending to, built a record system durable enough to report to us. And number 5, the marks stop. This is the payoff of the loop we opened at the start. Through the 1st and 2nd centuries, ownership inscriptions are common on recovered equipment. Move into the 3rd century, and the world around the army comes apart. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome burned through more than 20 emperors, most of them raised and murdered by their own troops. The silver content of the coinage collapsed, from around 90% fine under Augustus to under 5% by the reign of Gallienus in the 260s, which meant the cash economy the deduction system depended on was dissolving, and the state increasingly paid and supplied its soldiers in kind, in rations and requisitioned goods, rather than in money worth saving. In exactly this period, the ownership inscriptions thin out dramatically, and by the 4th century the picture has transformed. Under Diocletian and his successors, the state established centralized arms factories, the fabricae, studied in detail by the archaeologist Simon James, and the late Roman administrative register known as the Notitia Dignitatum lists roughly 35 of them across the empire, each with a specialty: shield works at Trier, arrow works, a factory for heavy cavalry armor at Antioch, mass-producing standardized equipment as government property, issued to soldiers rather than sold to them, staffed by workers who were branded to prevent desertion from their posts. The deduction system faded, the private ownership faded, and with them faded the reason to punch your name into your helmet, because the helmet was no longer yours. Per the surviving evidence, that is the most likely explanation for the silence. And the silence matters, because the classical legion, The self-accounting brotherhood of owner soldiers organized into centuries was dissolving into something else. A mass army of state-equipped troops, larger on paper, cheaper per man, and bound to the institution by ever weaker threads. A soldier who owns his equipment has equity in the army. A soldier who is handed everything by a factory has a job. The disappearance of a scratch mark from the archaeological record is, in miniature, the disappearance of a world. Before we close, one practical gift, because after this video you may find yourself standing in front of a Roman helmet in a museum, in the British Museum, or the Romano-Germanic Central Museum in Mainz, which holds much of the Rhine material, or the Site Museum at Vindolanda itself, and you can now do something most visitors cannot. Read it. Look along the neck guard first, because that broad, flat surface was the favorite writing space. Then the inside of the bowl and the cheek pieces, and search for the sideways V, often small, often faint, sometimes catalogued only in the object label's fine print. The name immediately after it, in the possessive, is the centurion, the unit address. The name after that is the owner. If you find 2, 3, or 4 owner names, you are looking at a service history. Oldest marks usually shallowest and most worn. And notice what is almost never there: the legion's number. The eagle, the famous numbered legions, the things Hollywood puts front and center, are absent from the objects the soldiers themselves marked. And that absence is the single most honest piece of testimony we have about where a Roman soldier believed he belonged. One caveat: do not expect to find inscriptions on every helmet. Many are too corroded. Some types were rarely marked, and parade and cavalry sports equipment follows its own rules. But when the marks are there, you will see them now, and you will know that you are not looking at decoration. You are looking at the operating system of an empire. So return one last time to the Rhine, to that dredged bronze helmet with its 4 punched names. 4 men, across perhaps half a century, each of whom paid for that helmet out of wages of a few hundred denarii a year, each of whom scratched his name and his centurion's name into the metal so that a clerk with a wax tablet could keep his century's books straight. None of them was thinking about history. They were thinking about theft and pay deductions and getting their property back after a bad day. And yet that small act of self-interest, repeated by hundreds of thousands of soldiers across 3 centuries, built the most legible, most accountable, most administratively durable army of the ancient world, and left us a paper trail written in bronze. The legions did not run on discipline alone or courage alone. They ran on a sideways V and a punched name, on 80-man ledgers balanced one helmet at a time. And when that quiet system died, the army that conquered the world went with it. If this changed the way you will look at the next Roman artifact you see, consider subscribing to the War Room Files and leaving a like, because it genuinely helps these longer stories reach the people who want them, and it tells us to keep going deeper. I will see you in the next one.